Well, welcome everybody. I'm so thrilled to be here for Comic-Con at home. Have an idea here that I wanted to present live, but I have a feeling that eventually a lot more people are going to see this panel in the long run than if we had done it live here on Comic-Con at home. I'm Larry Nemecek. Some of you know me as Dr. Trek from many issues in Star Trek across the years. A lifelong fan, but I've been a front row participant in the Star Trek community universe almost as long. And many of you know me from the Star Trek Next Generation Companion, where I met two of the folks on our panel today. Today, the Trek Files from Roddenberry Podcasts, Life Support Log with Dr. Ali Matu, and Trekline Tuesdays Live, and Portal 47. And most of all, yes, a lifelong fan of Star Trek. And one of those appeals that Star Trek has always had is its science. Yes, I know we have matter, antimatter with the lithium element filtered it all through, but Star Trek is the one show over the years that was groundbreaking in trying to bring us real science, or at least real best projected science. And starting on day one with Harvey P. Lynn of the Rand Corporation, Gene Roddenberry reached out to him, and eventually we got phasers instead of lasers, warp drive instead of time warp drive, that kind of thing. Well, I'm thrilled today to have what I think basically are all the formally titled science advisors for the Star Trek series since the 5th season of Next Generation. Yes. So let me get underway. The newest member of our group is, a lot of you have been meeting her the last few years at Star Trek Vegas and on the Star Trek cruise and innumerable science talks at all kinds of venues. Dr. Erin Macdonald. Erin, so good to have you with us.
Hi, thank you. I'm really excited to be here. This is a esteemed crowd that I'm just honored to be a part of now, so thank you.
I just want to say, we've got you with Star Trek and with Orville Redux, the series. I'm going to introduce everybody in the same way in just a second, but as far as you go, we have not seen your credits on screen yet, to be certain, to be sure, but you've been neck deep in it so far. I know you've been advising your little heart out already, which we will get to in just a second. Let me bring everybody else in because we've got so much to do today. I want to make sure and get everybody in. To my right, everyone's gonna be on my right because it's
okay.
There we go. So Naren Shankar. I'm going to have everybody tell their origin stories, but now a lot of you know Naren as the showrunner for the storied years on CSI, and of course, right now going into a 5th season on Cosmos as the showrunner, obviously.
Whoa. No. The Expanse, my friend.
Did I say the Expanse? Now, if this was live, there'd be like this round laughter applause all through the room. Yes. The Expanse. Say it loud, say it proud. Which I love, has had a comeback story the last couple of years, thankfully, on Amazon.
Thank you.
Yes, wonderful. And before that, all the storied years on CSI. But starting out, well, the common thread that we've got here on Star Trek. So I want to get to let everybody tell us how they got here. So yes, I brought up the Orville. He's currently working on the Orville. Also had worked on Cosmos. Producer André Bormanis. Get in here, sir. Say something so you're on camera.
Hi, nice to see you all.
This is the virtual rules now.
Good to see Naren after all these years. We have not seen each other. Bumped into each other a couple of times, I guess, at Comic-Con and so on. But
as is typical, and now we're just doing it now.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Now, virus that keeps us all from socializing.
No.
We'll check in and see how everybody's current projects are, but I just want to say, let me see here. Naren, all your years on The Expanse, all 5 years, right? Is co-EP, showrunner on that.
No, as EP, I'm the showrunner from day one.
That's what that's what I meant. Okay, yes.
Oh, yeah.
Andre is now a co-exec on the Orville. Also 3 writing credits. Everybody's writing here. We all started with, or the guys who have been in the industry a little longer, wound up with a lot of writing credits. Science was the beginning, and a lot of you had ambitions to get there.
Yes.
I just want to say, here's the bottom line. As far as our Star Trek focus goes, Naren coming to Next Generation, wanting to be a writer, science advisor for the fifth and sixth seasons, staff on the seventh, yay. Left at the end of Next Generation and went down a path that led to CSI and then The Expanse, but wound up with 9 episodes on writing credits on TNG, 2 on DS9, and 1 on Voyager. André here, I think, may have the record. All 7 seasons of Voyager and DS9 as science advisor. The last season, Next Generation, all 4 not credited, but you were the science guy on Enterprise. And had 7 episodes on Voyager credited, writing credit, and 12 episodes on Enterprise writing credit. So, and I know Erin, like I said, has already been up to her neck in this. So why don't I just go down the line and ask everybody, what was your actual origins? Oh, and by the way, this is a science panel. Just in case anyone has any doubt that we have some cred here. Erin has her PhD in astrophysics and general relativity at the University of Glasgow, the BS in astrophysics and mathematics at the University of Colorado, with postdoctoral work with the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory, the LIGO. André has his BS in physics at the University of Arizona, his MA in science, technology, and public policy at George Washington University. And Naren has his PhD in BS in applied physics and electrical engineering from Cornell. So there, everybody. Erin, why don't you tell us how you actually, I know you wanted to be a communicator as much as a scientist too. Tell us just the brief log line of how you wound up at Star Trek's door.
I will make it as brief as possible. I think everyone here knows that it's a bit of a circuitous route that we take to get into this industry, coming from a science background. But yeah, I mean, I was always interested in the entertainment industry. It was always been a passion of mine, you know, that creative half. But I also had a big passion for science. And so I just wanted to study more astrophysics was really what it was. I just found space fascinating. The idea that I could research it and be a part of learning something new about our universe was what really excited me. And so, yeah, as you mentioned, I did my undergrad in physics and mathematics. Then I went overseas to the University of Glasgow with the LIGO collaboration, searching for gravitational waves. I left about a year before their Nobel Prize winning detection, so it's fine. And then, as you mentioned, I got into science communication. I worked at community college and museums. Through that, I started teaching at Comic-Cons, conventions, sci-fi conventions, teaching the science behind this stuff, met a lot of writers, met a lot of creators, and just made a lot of good connections. People, you know, wanted to ask for my help with my background. Fell in love with doing that, moved out to LA. As you mentioned, I got plugged in giving talks at Star Trek. And then with this new world of Star Trek that we have right now with our 6 shows under development, they thought that having someone to be a common thread with the technology and try to keep all the star dates and the technobabble and the planets and everything in order. It is a crash course in writing, and I'm, like I said, I'm honored to be on this panel. I think the path that everyone here has taken is something that I am passionate about. Being in 6 rooms at once is definitely a learning experience, and yeah, I'm just excited to see my name in credits and then see what the future holds.
Well, I've got to say that you're the junior member of the panel only in years, because I don't think anybody else can compare to being in 6 different rooms yet. That's kind of crazy, but that's the state of Wait, Star Trek.
You mean 6 total rooms or 6 rooms of Star Trek? I mean, that's they're different things.
I'm talking Naren, I'm talking 6 rooms of Star Trek.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
We've never had 6 Star Trek series at the
No, there have never been. Never been.
Never more than 2 when Naren and I were there.
I was going to say, people have wished for there to be 6 rooms of Star Trek.
Yeah. Was there not like a 3? Was there 3 at one time? Brief overlap, wasn't there? I think
well,
it was Voyager.
The Voyager development over Next Gen.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, maybe that's
Yeah.
how I remember it.
I remember reading the Voyager pilot pretty early on, and I think we were still shooting Next Gen when that was happening. So yeah.
Yeah, I
But that was
remember when Renee stole it out of the desk and we read it because no one would give it to us.
Wasn't me. Wasn't me.
Oh no, that was us.
If you can't trust a staff writer, who can you trust? Oh wait. No, so Andre, talk about your voyage to Star Trek.
Well, yeah, unexpected and circuitous, as Erin mentioned. I fell in love with astronomy when I was a kid, growing up in Arizona and seeing Saturn for the first time through a telescope, seeing the Milky Way out in the in the high mountains in the desert when it was just a solid white band of light. I just was blown away by the immensity of the universe and the beauty of it, and made a decision at the age of 9 or 10 probably to become an astronomer, and didn't even reconsider that choice until I was well into college. But I also loved Star Trek. I loved writing. I loved Carl Sagan, who was a brilliant communicator, and the fact that he had such great facility with language was something that appealed to me. And I recognized at a pretty young age the difference between somebody like Carl Sagan writing about astronomy and space science and other people who were practicing scientists who didn't have his skill with words. In fact, I remember I was 11 years old, I think, when I read his first book, The Cosmic Connection. And I would have read it in one sitting, but I had to force myself to put it down because I was so amazed by all of the ideas in this book. I had to stop and just think about them, And then got to college, did a bachelor's in physics, did a year of grad school in physics. And I did that because I didn't have any other options at the time. It was a recession. I was hoping to work for a year or two, like a semiconductor company or something like that, but no real jobs. And so I kind of went into it without any clear vision of what I wanted to do, and it was pretty miserable. I also had a competing interest in music, and after my year in physics, I did a year in piano performance and composition, just to kind of clear my head. And I knew I wanted to do something that combined both sort of the art and the science side, the writing and the exploration of space. Got an opportunity to do a NASA fellowship at the George Washington University in a program that was all about space policy and the history of the space program, the politics, and I got to work on great projects, had a great thesis advisor, worked with astronauts and engineers and scientists. And that was really where I found that, this is where I want to be, right? Very long story about how I got offered the science consultant job. I'd written a Star Trek Next Gen spec that they'd read and rejected, but it was a thanks but no thanks, but nice job. I decided I wanted to go pitch stories, and you could send them a spec script, but you couldn't go into pitch stories without an agent. And I had a couple of friends here in California who were becoming writers, and they said, oh, if you go to the Writers Guild, there's a list of agents who will take first time writers. So I went through the list and I got a lot of no's, and then finally I got a yes from the same agency that I believe Naren was at the time, Montero
That's right.
Rose. Mm-hmm. And one of the agents, Freda Rose, I think, said, hey, they're not interested in getting any pitches from outside writers right now, but they're looking for a new science consultant. One of our clients has been doing that job, and he just got promoted to the writing staff, and they want somebody who has both a science background but also understands something about writing. Somebody who knows the show, knows how to read a script, knows how to talk to writers. And so I got a phone call from Jerry Taylor. She and I hit it off over the phone. I was at a planetary science conference in Tucson a month or two later, where I happened to meet Freeman Dyson. And I arranged to go out and do an in-house interview at Paramount. So I met Jerry and Naren and Brandon Braga and Ron Moore and Ira Bear. And I was like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm with all these people. And then and Michael Piller gave me a second draft of a Deep Space Nine script he'd written as my audition script. And he showed me how Naren formatted his notes. And this was 1993. Okay, I'm just going to set the time period. But for the younger people in the audience, I drove home to Phoenix, where my parents lived, and I was staying with them while I was on this little trip. Went to the library There's no such thing as an internet at the time, at least not a widely available World Wide Web. Went to the library, I read the script, went to the library, got some reference books. I looked at how Naren did his notes. I wrote up like 9 pages of notes for Michael Piller. Faxed them to the Paramount office. They used to have called a fax machine. Look it up. And a couple of weeks later, I got a call from Jerry Taylor saying, "Hey, we really liked your notes. Michael likes it. If you want the job, it's yours." And they needed me to start literally to the week that my NASA fellowship in Washington, D.C. ended. So in May of 1993, I loaded up the truck and I moved to Beverly from D.C., or at least West Los Angeles, and thus started my illustrious career as a science consultant. And eventually, I got to pitch stories to Jerry Taylor, and I probably pitched 15 before they bought one, but then they bought another one the following month. And then they asked me to do a Voyager teleplay because the writing staff was shorthanded, and they liked that well enough to have me do another. So that's kind of how I got that ball rolling.
Off and running. So Naren, so you're the I almost said the old man of this group, but I don't mean that in
I can't dodge it. I'm not sure I can anymore. So
coming in from that wonderful show you showrun called The Expanse. Okay. No, so that's they did have a science advisor at the time who was a scientist, and then basically I guess they were wanting someone who had like Andre was saying, had writer credit. But what was your personal path to the Hart Building there?
My path was, I started in when I went to college. It was, I started as an art student. It was like I didn't know what I wanted to do. It was French literature or medieval studies or who knows what, but I was in the college of liberal arts college at Cornell. But I'd always loved science. I always loved math. My entire life, I was a generalist, I think, at heart. And I transferred into the engineering college. And so I went through, got my degree, went to graduate school. And while I was in graduate school, I just started gravitating back towards writing, history, literature. And so just it kind of happened organically. I was in a fraternity called the Kappa Alpha Society, and we did a lot of creative writing just for fun ourselves. And so, and that's actually where I met Ron Moore. We were friends in college, and so we had another friend in common who he was the guy who wanted to get into the film business. Ron was a political science major, but while I was in graduate school, this third friend of ours went out to LA to like break into the business. And then like a year or two later, he grabbed Ron and said, Ron, come out to LA and be a writer. And I was like, sure, I'll do that. And with about as much thought. And then while I was in graduate school, I got to the end of it and I just decided I didn't want to be an engineer anymore. And I think it was one of those things where I still remember the moment it happened, which was I started taking all of these courses like that I didn't actually have to when I was in, working on my dissertation. But I came out of this amazing history lecture and I was walking back to my lab and I was like, God, I just don't want to be there anymore, because it sort of felt like, the way I describe it typically is that, I was becoming more and more of a master of a smaller and smaller corner of the universe. And I think at my heart, I didn't like that. But I finished, got my doctorate, and I didn't know what to do. I'd taken a bunch of job interviews. I got an offer from General Dynamics to build big missile systems. I didn't want to do that. I really wanted a job at Apple, which I didn't get. I kind of came down to like the last two. But I didn't know what I wanted to do. And Ron called me up and said, hey, come out to LA and be a writer. And I was like, sounds great. And it was just literally that. Mm-hmm. And I slept on his couch for a while, and I wrote a Star Trek spec and sent it to the Senate because they had the open submission policy, the famous open submission policy at Star Trek that Andre was talking about. And Ron got it in front of the right people, and through that I got the Writers Guild had an internship program, so I actually started as a Writers Guild intern on the staff. And that's when the science consultant thing happened, which was they had a science consultant that they weren't, that wasn't actually kind of working with the show, from what I understand. I don't think I've met him, but it was too scientific. It was like he wasn't, really he was kind of squashing the dramatic elements of stories. And so after my Writers Guild internship was done, they said, you know, you'd be interested in coming in as a science consultant because you know the show. And so that's really where it began. It kept me around. I got to pitch stories, and you know, finally, you know, that led to a script, and then another script, and then a rewrite, and then, you know, about a year and a half after I came out to LA, you know, they put me on staff in season 6. And again, I was so lucky. I mean, there's a million elements of luck, you know, in that story. And I think that's always, you know, the key in Hollywood, unfortunately, is, you know, getting that first break is really tough. And you just have to, you know, it is often, you know, just a matter of luck, and just being in the right place at the right time, knowing the right people, being around the right people. And, you know, when you get that break, what you do with it, that's a little bit more under your control, certainly. But that's how it started, and then I think it was season 7. I think when Deep Space Nine was starting up, or season 6. I can't.
That was
Six.
season 6. Because
season 6.
Yeah.
Because I was doing both. I was doing both shows for a while, or the first couple of years, and then I think when I got on staff, I wanted to sort of push off that particular job. So
you had a lot of the R&D for DS9 before you even got here, I'm sure.
Well, there was, again, it was, you know, there's a while, there's a lot of script notes on things. I mean, it was, you know, but
especially in the ramp up time on a Star Trek, there's all kinds of insane things. So your path and everyone's path a little bit here. What I wanted to get to, since we're talking about Star Trek and science, and Star Trek is like, always has its heart in the right place. Like I said, from the DNA, it was baked in the cake. Gene consulting with the Rand Corporation, Harvey Lin, and then I love saying his name, Jesko von Puttkamer, on the first motion picture,
right?
Yeah.
Who really
Good
kind
name.
of encapsulated for the first time exactly what warp drive would look like in a pseudo-science projected, you know, way, subspace and bubbles and all that. But I want to ask all three of you what I think of as like a dance between someone coming from real science and dealing with that, you know, how much of a compromise spectrum it is. The story is going to, you know, it's like the good of the science outweighing the good of the story, or the one, which would be the writer's ego, I guess.
You're like drifting around a Star Trek moment here, though. You know, the good of the many. It sounds like that's where you're heading.
I was hoping that wouldn't be lost. No, I mean, but you know, it's like a dance, right? It's like, as a scientist, you want, as the advisor, and then especially when it's your own script, you want to infuse it with what you can, and you certainly don't want to go something wackadoodle, as you know, Hurley once said. So somebody take a shot at that. What's that dance like? And do you just say sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, or later on you go, oh, we could have done this, or so and so on staff was just not going to hear it? I mean, maybe
we should go historically, because I think it's changed a little bit over the years.
I wanted to talk about the evolution too. Yeah, because the audience has gotten much savvier and evolved.
Exactly. And I think early on, what I remember, my overriding impression of it was, oh, this isn't really about science. This is about the sort of the invented science of Star Trek. It was more about making that consistent and making sure things worked the same way. So it was more about internal logic, because, you know, famously Star Trek, especially Next Generation, you know, the technobabble generator was like, that was actually a friend. I don't know if you know this story, but that was actually a friend of mine sent me it as a joke. Was a columns of like you know, pick one from column A and column B and a particle and this, and you get this effect. And it was
a
hilarious.
Highlight of my shows at cons for years. Yes.
Well, I put it on the wall of my office. And people started using it to write the dialogue on the show. I mean, it's like, because Brandon didn't care about it, Renee didn't care about it. It's like they just came in there and they just started, you know, using it, and that thing developed into like an actual chart and became more and more elaborate, and people started using it. But that, in and of itself, sort of encapsulates the show's relationship to science in a way. It was like, because the writers who wrote the show, many of them were like, you know, at that era especially, were coming from cop shows and doctor shows, and they just would, like, in their script, they would go, tech is like little blocks of things, and that was your job, to fill that stuff in. It's not really about science. It was like spray-on science, you know. It was like a friend of mine once told me, he goes, science fiction is bullshit with a thin metal coating. It certainly can be that.
Yeah.
It's not always that way, but I think and that was, I think, at the early days, that's what the show was. It was
it was
jargon.
Yeah, even then that Star Trek still at least tried harder to have the best spray on science out there.
Well, I think the truth of the show in many ways was the things that it expressed, like the diagnostic imagers, the non-invasive imaging, the communicators, those were all concepts that were way, way, way ahead of their time. And so it was kind of imbued in the show. The science was, but the way it was expressed sometimes through technobabble was just kind of goofy.
Yeah. Andre, what do you any major?
Yeah,
you had the most years in, and this evolution in attitude kind of happened on your watch with Star Trek.
A show like ER comes along and it raises the bar for the the credibility of the language that people are using. And I thought about, in terms of dialogue and the kind of thing that Naren was talking about. Obviously, we had Mike Okuda and Rick Sternbach's Bible, the Star Trek technical manual, which laid out in great detail all of these fictional components and how they're described. And, you never want to use, the wrong term for the thing inside the warp nacelle. It's deuterium cortinide, damn it, and it's got to be
God
that.
forbid.
People
Obviously.
care.
Obviously.
People care. It's part of what makes the universe believable for that hour that you're watching the show, right? The willing suspension of disbelief. If there isn't a credible foundation that you're building your stories on, you're going to lose the audience. And that was the genius of Roddenberry's initial, conception of the show. He wanted the Starship Enterprise to feel like a real place. And so he thought about, well, what will we need in the future? If we're going to build a ship, no idea how warp drive is going to work, but we're going to say, someday we'll discover how to make this happen. We're going to be able to build this giant ship with 400 people on it that can get from one star to another star 5 or 6 light years away in a few days. Okay, that's the foundation. How do we make that seem real? Well, you have to have certain elements in place. You've got to have the bridge to control everything. You've got to have the sick bay. Well, what's a sick bay in the future going to look like? They're not going to be sticking needles in people's arms and put thermometers, in their orifices to get their temperature. You have a diagnostic bed, some scanning device, something with radar, right, or infrared. All of these things that were cutting edge in the 1960s, he just extrapolated out into the future with his many advisors. I remember hearing a great story about how a few weeks after the show premiered, and they'd featured the sickbay a few times, Roddenberry started getting letters from corporate executives at like GE and Siemens saying like, how did you know we were working on these things? And it's like, well, he didn't. He just asked logical questions and thought about the technologies that were, being developed at the time, and took him a couple of 100 years into the future. So that clearly was a big part of the job. But we also, started to do a lot more stories that were based on scientific concepts. Like symbiogenesis was a concept that Ken Biller read about and thought, oh, there's a great Star Trek story in this. The ones that were trickier for me were, especially Brandon loved to turn the ship into a haunted house, and some crazy stuff would happen. We did an episode, season 7, was it Genesis? Where the crew starts devolving into...
of Next Generation. Yeah,
that was a Next Gen.
Thanks to what? T-cell?
No, introns, I believe, at the time. Was the
one little sliver of real science that we could hang that on,
And Bang Barkley's the spider. Yes.
I think that was Minosky, right? Wasn't it?
It might have been Minosky.
I think it was Minosky. Yeah.
I hope so.
Yeah.
But again, it's like, here's this little idea that there are these segments of DNA that don't seem to serve any useful purpose in the human genome, at least today, but maybe they're pieces left over from our ancestors that are no longer coding for proteins or whatnot. What if some virus activated these things and we started to devolve? Well, if some virus activated your introns, whatever they might be, you're not going to devolve into an Australopithecine. But all right, we have this.
It's not one of our finer moments.
Not one of our finer moments.
It really
I rolled with it. I tried to do what I could do with it. I talked to a doctor friend of ours, John Glasgow, and I said, "Is there any way in hell that we can make this better?" And he's like, "I don't think so."
It was beautifully directed and certainly creepy,
yes.
but it was.
But the bigger problem,
Make that budget push to the extreme. Yes.
Yeah, but it's like, well, okay, so Riker's an Australopithecine, and and Deanna Troi turns into a spider or something. It's like, well, suppose that happens and we reverse it. Well, Riker's brain was a quarter of its original size when he was that Australopithecine character. And then we reverse it, and now he's Riker again with all of his memories and all of his skills. And it's like, really? Really? It's just it's, you can't just, and you just have to every once in a while say, oh, you know what? We're doing a horror show. This is not science fiction. This is horror fantasy. Right. Okay? And the audience would let us get away with that, I think, once in a while. We could not do that on a regular basis and still be Star Trek. But I will tell you one other little thing, and then I want to hear from Erin. I'm sorry if I'm taking up all the air in the conversation here, but
we're
another 7th season episode, Inheritance, I think was the title, involved a planet that was undergoing these terrible earthquakes and tsunamis, and all sorts of bad things were happening because its core was cooling. And the Enterprise was called in to reheat the planet's core. Now remember, this is an Earth, Class M Earth-type planet, 8,000 some odd miles in diameter. The core of a planet like the Earth, mostly iron and nickel. It's couple 3,000 miles in diameter, and we're going to change the temperature of this thing before the closing credits of the show run. There's this thing that Erin and Naren, I'm sure, are very familiar with, called thermal inertia. Not real easy to take something as dense as iron or nickel and get it really hot really quickly, right? So we quickly, converged on the idea, well, we got to do something in the phaser beams, what could it be? And I thought, well, we got to use a fictional particle. And we called them nadions or something like that. And I proposed that here is our model for how we're going to think about the science of what the Enterprise is doing. If you had told somebody 100 years ago that you could introduce a microscopic, invisible, submicroscopic number of little particles into a giant pile of metal, and within the course of a few hours, increase the temperature of that pile of metal by hundreds of degrees, they would have laughed. They would have said, you're crazy. What the hell are you talking about? That's exactly how a nuclear chain reaction works. That's how nuclear fission plants work, right? You introduce a handful of these invisible neutrons into a pile of, uranium or whatever, uranium tetroxide or whatever they're fashioning these things out of these days. Interesting story. My grandfather was a chemist. He used to design control rods for nuclear reactors back in the 50s and 60s. At any rate, that was the analogy I had in my mind, and that's how I conjured all of the engineering technobabble around that with Data and Geordi, right? And I think that that's a good example of how science fiction can work, because we clearly don't know everything today. And we're learning a lot more every day. And I think we would not be doing our jobs properly as science consultants if we didn't once in a while say, you know what? Some of the things that we think we know today to be true are going to be proven to not be true in the future. Because there's just no credible universe in which 400 years from now, some of our most basic assumptions about physics, chemistry, biology, and so forth have not been questioned and reevaluated and changed, right?
Well, Star Trek can't work if you don't question the premise of nothing can go faster than the speed of light.
Sure.
Well,
right.
You don't have the basic layout of the show. You can't have interstellar cooperation. So Erin may have the toughest job here of all, because you, like I said, you've been up to your eyeballs sciencing for these people, for writers, and we haven't seen any of the plots. So we're in kind of that, no spoilers or die dictum here. But you obviously, I'm sure, been through, because I have one question I got to throw at you here that I know you've spoken on, but what's that dynamic like? What kind of fields have you gotten into where you bring it and it's like, well, story this and story that? And how have you handled that dance of the compromise? Oh, look, guys, we can all win. Here's great science that makes a great story. Or
yeah, and I like the kind of order that we went in, because I think it speaks to the situation of science fiction wholesale right now, is that there's a lot of content out there. There's a lot of providers, whether it's Star Trek making 6 shows or just the amount of science fiction shows that are out there right now. and audiences have the internet at their fingertips. And so a lot of shows are striving to at least not be wrong. And Naren brought up the great example of, you know, I think quite commonly a lot of writers will call their science buddies and say, hey, can you help me with this? And then it ends up being not a positive experience because those scientists don't understand the writing process and that trade-off that you have to do between the science and the fiction. And sometimes you just step away and say, all right, I'll just make sure you don't say anything super wrong. Do what you want to do, and we'll just keep an eye out for how you're explaining it. And sometimes it's better to just not explain it. Just say they evolved into spider people, and then we got them back, and then we're good. And because if you're going to try to explain it, you can get yourself into trouble so much. But I think, so that's kind of been my experience in Hollywood. And I think particularly right now, you know, obviously we have the two people here between the Orville and Cosmos and the Expanse, and where, because you guys are at the helm of those, it's baked into it already, but there is so much sci-fi content out there who are looking for scientists. And it's not an easy job. And, and it is, there's so many times where it's just all about the relationship you have with the writer, and it's important to be a positive influence in the room and to say yes and not no. Science says no, that's dumb. You know, just
Not
say okay, let's
Downer.
work with it.
Yeah. What kind of the since we're dealing with episodes and series even not yet seen, what are some of the, are you getting called upon for advising? Are the plots going in all kinds of directions? As far as the major fields, did you find yourself or trained?
Well,
can I say real quick, 6 shows, including 2 animated, and I'm curious about what that dynamic is.
Yeah, it's interesting because the way that they've brought me on, and, you know, I wasn't involved in season 1 of Picard. I was brought on for season 3 of Discovery, which has yet to air. You know, so they're all at different stages, but they all have very different feelings as well. I think obviously kind of having bringing in the Pike show is, you know, pulling on that nostalgia type thread. And then you have like Lower Decks and then the Nickelodeon show. Lower Decks is targeted to be more of a comedy for Star Trek fans. And, you know, the animated show is trying to bring in a younger demographic with that same Star Trek feeling. So they're all kind of chasing different atmospheres. So they're all sci-fi shows. They're all in the Star Trek universe, but they all are very different types of science fiction shows. And as such, that reflects in how their relationship with me is. That, you know, some of them, especially I think with the kids one, the Nickelodeon show, have been highly involved in that show because they very much have that eye to the idea that they can inspire future generations with this, and that they are targeting a young demographic and want to be conscious of that from a scientific perspective. But then other shows are just like, hey, read the script and tell me if we screwed anything up. And some shows, you know, as we talked about the technobabble placeholders, mine is just, they'll say the quantum thing. So I just, you know, I'll read everything, but it's a flag if they say quantum. That was the code word for, Erin, please fix this. Please explain this for us.
That's funny.
It's almost like the tech has become such an icon. It's like I can just see a newer generation of writers like, okay, guys, we are not saying the tech in here. So quantum to quantum.
There's an important thing to think about here too, is that I think a lot of, you know, one of the way the term science fiction is actually used, it's like I could argue, you know, I think very effectively that Star Trek is at its core, it's an allegorical show. I mean, it's like, and so, like, you know, you can talk about like the solution to fixing the planet's core, you know, in one episode of Star Trek. The thing that's kind of odd about it is that, and I think that sort of distinguishes it and takes it away a little bit from sort of classic hard science fiction, is that it doesn't matter in the next episode. That same technology is never used again. Right. It's like we use the transporter for one thing one episode, then we forget about it in another episode. And it's like, and the reason for that is that's not actually what the show is about. It's not about, you know, being true to physics. Like The Expanse, for example, is the physics is baked into the show. And it's like, it's never an option. You can't forget about angular momentum. You can't forget about these concepts, because the drama is built around them. The mandate of the show is to make life in space feel as real as possible. So it's like that dictates almost everything around it. Star Trek, really, honestly, the pure science-y shows are very rare. It's like they really don't happen very much. And you could even make the argument that, like, you know, the shows that deal with time travel are more rigorous in terms of their internal logic across the board in Star Trek than any of the other things. If you think about the things the holodeck or the transporter has been used for all over in a row, you just go like, oh, it's just magic. It's like it can do whatever it wants. And so I think that's sort of the balance. It's like, you got to understand what the show is. You got to understand what these things mean to the show, because each show is expressing something a little bit differently. And that's you know, I think it's great that the animated show, Erin, is like giving a little bit more grounding maybe, and actually inspiring people. Let's use the horrid word, you know, infotainment, you know. it's like, but you know, I think that's a really good thing. It's just, you know, every expression of it is a little bit different.
And I think you bring up a really good point too, with the sort of infotainment side of it. I mean, that was the thing, kind of my origin story with moving into the entertainment industry, was realizing how much science fiction could be used to teach science. Absolutely. Whether it's a teaching moment to say, this is why that wouldn't work, but we can still teach science that way, or to say, hey, this is a really cool example of this actual scientific phenomenon. So there are a lot of opportunities. And, yep. And as you said, I think shows just kind of depend between that whole spectrum of science to fiction, where they want to fall in that. And the story changes too now. You know, they're being more serialized series that, you know, we're having these huge arcs that are happening, that it makes it harder to sort of have these anomalies happen and then just dump it and move on to the next one, because they're making longer story arcs now.
Although Pike is apparently now not going to be just nostalgic in character base, but more standalone, get back to the glory years of the standalone stories for all that later syndication.
I think that's a trend. I think that's a trend to go a little bit more episodic, and you know, this is how things work. Like, too much of serialization, people want episodic. Too much episodic, people want serialization.
That was Seth MacFarlane from the beginning with the Orville wanted it to be a serialized show, and allegorical, as Naren mentioned about, you know, Star Trek, because he missed that kind of storytelling on television. It has gone so far in the other direction, and he just wanted to see, you know, standalone shows again, you know, based on these kind of high concept, you know, premises that were an allegory for some social issue that we were interested in exploring in that particular episode, and that's what we're doing. So.
Right. Well, here's the thing. So I'm just curious, from all of your advising days, take off your writing hat if you've been wearing one lately. I've heard this from the creatives, like from the artists, from the art department guys, have to submit, you know, 3 or 4 designs for a producer to, and they always had their favorite, and they would always favor their favorite by making it great, and the other 3 options like really crappy, so that hopefully, even though they didn't have final say, they would, you know, get their best one approved.
Yeah.
Back in the day, and let's admit that the evolution, thankfully, of the room as well as the audience has evolved to be more science friendly and science savvy. But I'm just curious, for the sake of nostalgia, did anybody have a trick? I mean, did you have a tactful maneuver or deployment when you're giving advice, or whether it was by memo or whether you had a live chance? Anybody have a strategy for convincing a hard to convince case, or people that saw a brick wall and you say, oh no, look, we can have a win-win here? Anybody, or a story around that?
I would never shoot something.
For everybody, but go ahead.
I would never shoot something down without having an alternative at the ready.
That's always very good.
You know, I'm not sure about this, but what if we did it this way? And you know, I rarely just said something was absurd. You know, I mean, I would never.
I probably said that a lot. My approach is probably like, yeah, it's dumb. Do this.
Anybody have a memory of a great save where you went, oh, thank God I was able to do that because this.
Great save.
Come back to me next year.
Yeah. Yeah. She can't.
Well, you got 6 shows to
Can't
deal with.
talk.
One of them's gonna come through. You have a good story.
But
There
yeah,
was
I
a-
mean, I guess for me, like right now, like Andre, you said you can't just say no. A lot of times you have to have, but it's all about your relationship with the writers. You know, it's all about, even when they know they're writing something, they're like, Erin's gonna hate this. They send it and they're like, all right, we're just warning you, like this is gonna be the thing that you want to keep an eye out for. All of that, you know, I always offer, there's a priority, there's just suggestions, and then there's just observations, right? Aside things, whether they're science. The priority things are the things that I have the job for. The suggestions are things we can paint, the spray paint, and then, you know, so working that way, and then having them be comfortable enough with me to just say, hey, I don't know how to say this. Can you help me?
Well, that's a
It's all
very
about relationship.
Yeah, that, you know, once I'd established a good working relationship with the writers on the staff, and they got to know me and they liked me and they liked what I was doing, they would then, you know, come to me first in a lot of cases, and they'd call me on the phone and they say, hey, I got this idea, and, you know, oh, we're going to have a comet in this episode of Deep Space Nine. And, you know, I kind of know what a comet is, but how big are they? And what are they made of? And how fast do they move? And when does that tail thing happen? You know, so, you know, a lot of it, you know, once I was established, they liked me, they trusted me, you know, they would run stuff by me before they committed it to paper in many instances. There was still, you know, I'd still get scripts with the tech, you know, fill in the blank. But, you know, if there was a big science idea or some concept in the story that they thought could be really cool, really exciting, but they weren't sure what it really meant, and does it really work that way, and whatever, then they would call me, and we'd go through it.
Erin, I have a question for you, actually. What point do you come into the process? Are you in the room, or do you just get outlines, or when does it happen for you?
Yeah, it depends on the shows, because they're all at different stages, and then obviously the notes of me being a part of the franchise take a while to propagate as well. It's usually been that it's like, hey, we have this science person, and all right, you know, kind of like Andre said, you get a sample script and say, hey, can you just science these and then see how it works? But, you know, with some of them, it's been a pretty quick evolution to just say, oh no, okay, we trust her. Let's bring her into the room. Let's have her help with pitch docs. And I think I can see now how your career trajectories have gone the way that they've gone, because as you build that relationship, you're brought into more and more of the writing process and sitting in the room and breaking story and writing documents that are more on the writer's responsibility side. It just grows, but it really just depends on what the show wants to do. But I've found that over the time, as my credibility has grown within the franchise, then writers are more willing to blindly trust me now, because it's like, oh, well, they're using her, they say great things, thankfully, about her, and you should call her. Then that helps kickstart that relationship. So it's a little all over the place, but it's been great to have that responsibility grow. It's been fun.
Yeah. Well, guys, I think we have to kind of wrap it up here. It's about having a time. I don't have the person in the back of the room holding up the signs, so the time signs. But I just want to leave us here. Any memory of your greatest, as a science advisor on Trek, that the audience is going to know? Greatest win or greatest loss in the process? I kind of danced around that because everybody's got those. I can think of RVN Naren in Rascals for youthening people, or I can think of the Warp 10 evolution, Andre, that you were kind of saddled with. And
well,
I know you didn't invent
I would call
it.
that a great failure on my part. I would maybe argue that, you know, the things you don't see that you never saw on Star Trek, thanks to me. There are some, not a lot. There was one where they wanted to have a runner in some episode where Captain Picard was excited about taking a specially designed kayak down lava tubes all the way down to the core of a Class M planet. And I said,
that's a good idea.
I think Jules Verne might have been able to get away with that in some weird way, but not us. So how about, you know, maybe
that's not even as flashy as the boy bands every week on
wow.
yeah. Well, guys, I think why don't we leave it there? I just do want to do I did this, we didn't launch with them. How about we do it at the end? I'm going to go to gallery view. Everybody, show off your, now that we all know who we all are. Yay. Okay. Anyway, guys, thanks so much for it's, science advising it has evolved, thankfully, and it's wonderful to look back at the early years. I'm just thrilled that I got this assemblage of expertise here, and everyone all in various stages of their careers here and what everybody's done. But everybody in this window has been a Star Trek fan, and the franchise is all the better for it and will be in the future. So thanks a lot, guys.
Hey, thanks for putting this together. It's great seeing all of you.
Yeah, it's really fun. Good to see you, Andre. So nice to meet you, Erin.
Thank you. Yeah, this has been an honor.
We'll see each other in the flesh one of these days soon.
We will.
Yes. How about one more time with the signs?
Okay.
I put mine away.
There we go.
You want to see a big white cat?
There we go.
No, just your sign, Andre.
Aww,
Alfie.
nice.
He's been quietly sitting here with me the whole time.
I'm trying to do a
Awesome.
snapshot.
I love that. Okay,
Yeah, there we go.
there we
Okay. Speaking of cats. Okay. Okay, guys. Thanks so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, guys.
Thanks a lot to Comic-Con at Home. We will see you live down the road at some point.
Absolutely. Take care,
Live
guys.
long and prosper, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Truck well.